All right, let's get right into this. We're talking about a really stunning development coming out of Venezuela. A sitting president, Nicolás Maduro, has reportedly been captured by U.S. forces. Now, this is way more than just a headline. According to the analysis we're looking at, this whole thing is a story packed with betrayal, high-stakes geopolitics, and it might just signal a brand new, kind of scary era of global power plays. So, the first thing our source material points out is how this wasn't framed. This wasn't a war. I mean, think about it. On one hand, you have a full-scale invasion, right? That means heavy fighting, lots of resistance, and sadly, casualties. But what was reported here? Well, it was the complete opposite. A swift, targeted operation, over in a matter of hours, and get this, 0 U.S. casualties reported. That difference, that stark contrast is everything. It's really the key to unlocking what might have actually gone down. And that brings us right to the heart of the mystery, doesn't it? I mean, how on earth do you capture the leader of a sovereign country, a country with its own army and air force, in just a couple of hours without a single American casualty? It doesn't add up. So, looking at the reports, what's so bizarre is that there was basically no fight at all. U.S. helicopters were flying over the capital, Caracas, and Venezuela's pretty sophisticated air defense system, totally silent. You had Venezuelan security forces on the ground, but they didn't mount any kind of organized resistance. It's this total lack of a response that's the real puzzle here. It just screams that something else was going on behind the curtain. And this is where the analysis we're looking at puts forward a really compelling theory. This wasn't a military victory. Nope, it was a transaction, a business deal. The source is pretty much convinced that the only explanation that makes any sense for the complete lack of fighting is that some kind of deal was made. Yeah, so this is what the source dubs the betrayal theory. And it's exactly what it sounds like. The thinking is, this whole operation wasn't one with bullets and bombs, it was one with bank transfers. The allegation is that key people, really high up in the Venezuelan military and government, were paid off. They were bribed to just stand down and look the other way, essentially selling out their own president and letting U.S. forces waltz right in. And according to the source, this wasn't some snap decision. This was planned out, carefully, over weeks. You had U.S. forces building up in the area, but not really doing much. Why? Well, the theory is that during that quiet period, these incredibly complex and secret negotiations were happening. It all built up to that one critical moment. The bribe is paid, the order comes down to stand down the air defenses, and just like that, the path is clear to grab Maduro. So what kind of leverage are we talking about? Well, remember this. In the weeks leading up to this, the U.S. publicly put a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head. $50 million. Our source argues that wasn't just talk, for the cameras. It was a very clear, very loud signal of the kind of money that was on the table. Okay, so let's look at the official story. Publicly, the language being used is very, very specific. They're calling it a capture. The idea is to frame it as a legitimate law enforcement action against someone who's been indicted on criminal charges. It's all about making it sound legal and above board. But the analysis we're digging into has a much harsher take on it. They say, look, it doesn't matter what indictments are out there. When you go into another country and seize its leader, that's not a capture. That's a kidnapping, plain and simple. It's an act that completely shatters international law. All right, so this brings us to the bigger picture, the geopolitical fallout. Because an event like this doesn't just stay in Venezuela. Oh no, the shockwaves from this spread across the entire globe, sending a massive signal to both friends and enemies that maybe, just maybe, the old rules of the game are out the window. And just look at how this played out for Maduro's biggest allies. We're talking about major powers, China, Russia, and Iran. According to the source, they were all caught completely flat-footed. They were left looking totally powerless to do anything about it, especially in a region the U.S. has always seen as its own backyard. China especially gets a black eye here. The source actually uses the words very embarrassed. And you can see why. They're Venezuela's #1 economic partner. They buy their oil. And they literally had officials meeting with Maduro hours before he was captured. It points to a gigantic intelligence failure for them. They had no idea what was coming. And this really drives home a key point from the analysis. For all the talk about the rise of other global powers, the U.S. still has a unique ability to project power anywhere in the world. It's one thing for China and Russia to be strong in their own neighborhoods, right? But projecting real military force all the way into the Western Hemisphere? They just can't do it. The U.S., with its bases all over the globe, still has a massive advantage when it comes to operations like this one. So, okay, the operation itself might look like a clean, short-term win. But here's the thing. The source we're looking at argues that this fits a very familiar pattern, a playbook, if you will, and it's a playbook that often ends in disaster.
This is what the source calls the neocon playbook, and it almost always goes the same way. It starts with a bang, right? A big, dramatic capture. You get that mission accomplished moment, that feeling of a quick victory. But what happens next? Well, what often follows is a slow slide into chaos. A power vacuum opens up, resistance starts to bubble up, and things get messy.
And this analysis draws a straight line from this event to other U.S. interventions in the past, suggesting that the really hard part for the United States and Venezuela, well, it's just getting started. The argument is that history teaches us again and again that these kinds of operations almost always unravel over time. They tend to create way more problems than they solve. So, Maduro's gone. Now what? What happens to Venezuela? The lightning-fast operation might be over, but the future of an entire country is now completely up in the air. Well, the source predicts a really long and difficult road. Sure, a new leader backed by the US will probably be put in place, but they're going to face huge resistance. You can't just undo decades of social change from the Chavismo era overnight. The prediction is for more and more instability, and ultimately, it boils down to this. The US now owns Venezuela. It's the whole you break it, you buy it principle. All of their problems are now America's problems.
And really, this whole event is being presented as a sign of a much bigger shift in how the world works. It looks like we're leaving behind an era that was, at least in theory, governed by international law and a rules-based order. And we're entering a new one that's all about raw, unfiltered competition between great powers, with each one trying to carve out its own sphere of influence. The source contends that this is an era where, well, anything goes. It's described as a world of modern-day piracy, where the big players act with more and more ruthlessness to get what they want. Whether that's bombing a pipeline, seizing an oil tanker, or, yes, kidnapping the leader of a country. The old rulebook, it seems like it's been tossed right out the window. And all of this leaves us with one final and pretty chilling question. If a sovereign head of state can be taken out, not in a war, but through a covert deal, a buyout, what does that mean for the rest of the world? In a world like that, who could be next?